And Julie Morton's here. I've given a couple speeches to graduating classes about success comes from failure. And I'll just start with that and why we give back. We were very successful in business, but the only reason I was successful in business is I was rejected by 23 medical schools. 23. I wanted to be a doctor, and I failed miserably. But then I had to figure something out. I'd go get a job. I worked at Anderson Consulting, got into the industry through Baxter, and I never looked back. But it's only because I failed so miserably that then I could actually become a success. And we wanted to give that back. We are fortunate enough to do it now, and we will continue to.
That's great. So tell us the story of how you came to Booth.
Yeah, it was a long time ago, so it wasn't called Booth, but I came to the Graduate School of Business I actually took 2 adult education. There was a continuing education program for adults, and they would allow you to take any classes in any of the schools at Chicago, and you could get credit for them. And they were half price, but you could only take 4, and those could be applied to a transcript. And the other reason I came to Chicago is I didn't get into Kellogg, which is a running joke in our family from my wife, our brother-in-law, and my sister-in-law. They all went to Kellogg, but I went because I went to undergrad at Northwestern, but I did not get in. So and I'll just jump ahead. It changed my life. I was a biology major and a baseball player in college. I was not very smart. My joke always is my ERA was higher than my GPA. Obviously, my MCAT score was very low. But I didn't know anything about business. Nothing. I never had an econ class, accounting class, nothing. And I took my first class, was called Signaling by Candace Pendergast. I think he's still here. Yeah. He was a young guy back then.
Saw him today.
Did you? Well, if you see him say one of your students kind of made it. But it talked about how you signal through your career and how you can attract attention and how you succeed. And I learned so much sitting here. I didn't know anything about finance. And then later, when I would say, what's your superhero skill? My superhero skill is financing very destructed companies, distressed companies. And I learned it all in these buildings. I did.
I wonder if you think that influenced your finance?
Well, it definitely taught me I needed to get a job because I wasn't good enough to I had the privilege and the pleasure to pitch to a guy named Joe Girardi. If you're a Boston Red Sox fan, you probably hate him because he won 3 World Series as a Yankee, and then he was the Yankee manager for 10 years. So I grew up with Joe in Central Illinois, where I'm from, and then we were battery mates for 2 years. I love baseball, but it was not a career. That medical school was, when you throw 83 miles an hour, you're not gonna make. But I was undefeated in college.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about your early jobs and just how they led to you entering biotech.
Yeah. So I actually started off as a computer programmer at Anderson Consulting, but I was on their government projects. I did a telecom project, and then senior partner there, who was a baseball fan, her name was Karen Carbon. She was a U of C grad. She said, hey, I know you want to be in life sciences. She asked me to join the healthcare team, and I worked for the big we would call them IDNs now, integrated delivery networks. But back then it was like Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York, Johns Hopkins Hospital, Salmon's Cancer Center in Texas. And we went in and helped their processes and built better computer systems for them. And I was like, wow, now I'm back in the life sciences realm. I wanted to be a doctor. I can't do that, but maybe I can help hospitals and help them. Back then, we were trying to help them save money so they can invest better in their facilities and all that. But started off in IT, and that was my very first job. And then my girlfriend at the time, who became my wife, recruited me to Baxter Healthcare, and they had a joint venture with Bain Consulting, and I ended up working in that group. So I was in Copley a lot in Boston, and we actually started to do cost containment and improvement of patient care with these big delivery networks as well. That's what. Most of those were the Baxter clients. And so we went in there, and I was like, oh, I'm home. I always wanted to be in a hospital. I just do different things in a hospital.
So for students who are interested in going into biotech, how important would you say it would be for them to gain some experience in the hospital business?
I think you need to understand a couple things, how public and private payers work. For sure. That's a piece you have to understand. Well, that all the issues around United Healthcare and the big PBMs and managed care, you have to understand how that all works. But then you also have the vast majority of medicine's treated through these big academic centers or these big urban centers. But what they've also done over my career, they've been buying all the practices too, getting bigger because they need referral networks. And I saw that first at Hopkins back in the 90s. they were buying up the collar cardiology offices to put the cardiac cath patients into Hopkins. And then when they got them in there, cardiac surgery teams could actually get them. It was a kind of a channeling model. And you need to understand that because it affects our healthcare system dramatically, especially the cost piece. Low-income healthcare is almost always provided. If it's not in a Medicaid clinic, it's in the ER. When people get sick, they don't have a doctor. They just show up in the emergency room. The most expensive care in the world. And that's why one of the reasons our healthcare goes up. But you have to understand, you can understand that side of it. You can understand how pharma companies, med tech companies sell products into them. People like Anderson Consulting, SAP, all those sell services and software products into the hospitals. And then their links out in the community now with all the offices. It's really important because the product and the money flows through them. And all the big research is being done. The big grants are given to the big academic centers. So it's back to when I got out of college, when I knew I wasn't going to be a baseball player or a doctor. I read a Wall Street Journal article at the time. It said something like healthcare is going to be like 31% of the GNP. And I'm like, holy crap. There's got to be a job in there somewhere for me. And you can start at providers to the IDNs, software, insurance, whatever. There's plenty of opportunities out there, but you got to want to do it. You can also go into defense, automotive, manufacturing, software. You got to want to do it.
So what were other keys to your success that drove your ascent in the biotech industry?
I mean, a lot of my friends now, they'll say, "Oh God, I hate it when he says this." So I'm just a simple country boy, but it's true. I try to boil things down to like 3 major points about what you're looking at. And one of the things I learned here was how to tear apart a P&L and a balance sheet quicker than almost anybody, even people who are bankers. That's just a skill that I have. But you find your way, and I would just say follow your passion into whatever you want to do. Yeah, I did. I wanted to be a doctor, couldn't be a doctor. I wanted to work into industry. I found my way in through software. Then I went to work for Johnson & Johnson as an IT guy, and then moved over into business development, and then over into general management. And you don't have to have a defined career path. I've probably had 7 to 10 jobs in my life. All one led to another, but it wasn't linear.
What about taking on risk in your career? How important is that?
I think it's really important. I mean, how many of you have ever been fired? Yeah, some of you are lying. I know that. I've been in the last 6 or 7 companies, I've been fired every time because I've been the CEO and we sold the companies. But I've been fired. My last job, I got fired because I didn't get along with the board of directors. But I felt like I was right. I needed to stand my ground and what I thought was best for the company, and they thought they needed to stand their ground. And that was fine. It was very professional, but we agreed to disagree and to part ways. But you need to take calculated risk. Getting a degree from this school, or really any MBA that you're going to focus in finance, is incredibly important for what you're going to do in life sciences, whether it's in a product company, drug company, service company. Understand how these companies make money and how you can add value. After I took a role at UCB Pharma in Belgium back in 2007, and I was head of commercial operations and medical affairs it ended up being 32 countries across Europe and North Africa. Again, a simple country boy from Illinois with a blue passport, sure up in some of those countries was a little rough back then. So I only spoke a little bit of French. It was terrible. But when I did come out of there, I really learned how to work and live in Europe. And I ended up being asked to be a CEO of a Swedish med tech company. So when our family, Jake was coming back to Northwestern, Emmy came back to school in college, and I went to Sweden to run this med tech company that was really struggling. And it took me just under 4 years, but we got the thing profitable. We increased the sales tenfold, and we sold it for 10x its sales. So back then, it was a pretty small acquisition, like $260 million. But that company was making $1 million a year when I got there. That company could have easily gone under. And then the one I came back to here was being run by an activist shareholder. Cancer company with 4 products. When I got it, we had about $40 million in cash, and we were burning $20 million a quarter. So we had 2 quarters. So we were a public company. So we had a going concern. We had to raise money, and we had to call our pipeline down to one program. And I chose this, based on what I could see in the data, this little drug called tucatinib. And and it was in combination with trastuzumab and also capecitabine, which was risky. You were working 3 drugs into a cancer patient, breast cancer, HER2 positive breast cancer. And none of the investors wanted to invest in it. It's like, well, how do you know your drug works? And like, they didn't ask the magic question, like, let me see the CT scans too. But while we were doing it and we financed the company, 2 people did ask that question, Seagen and Eli Lilly. And then they duked it out. We sold that. We had maybe $100 million into that company. We sold it for like 620, 13 months later. I mean, it was a 6X. That drug got approved as Tukysa. It's an amazing drug for women of childbearing age who had breast cancer. And we were the first company to get, we went to the FDA and asked them if our data worked, that we would get the first CNS label, central nervous system label, for a cancer drug in breast cancer. What that meant is it worked on the systemic tumors in breast. It actually crossed the blood-brain barrier and went after the tumors in the brain. And these women were starting to get brain tumors because they'd been treated with antibodies for so long that couldn't make it to the brain. It was a sanctuary site for tumors. That old drug worked and their tumors just disappeared. It was one of the greatest things. But again, we could have gone out of business. Like we barely got the money raised for that company.
So how do you decide what to focus on in this kind of?
Yeah, and maybe talk about AMAG. I got asked to be the CEO at AMAG right at the beginning of the pandemic, April of 2020. They had about 800 people, women's health care in sexual dysfunction, interesting topic, benign hematology, which included like anticoagulants, but also iron products. And all these people were sitting in their basement because the pandemic was here. And we had to make a decision. We decided we were just going to totally exit the female healthcare business and take that off the table because we weren't making any money at it. So unfortunately, my 3rd week of being the CEO of the company on Zoom from my home in Kirkland, Washington, the company was based in Waltham, Massachusetts. Fast forward, I never met my management team till 18 months after the company was bought. We never could get together because of the pandemic, but we worked as a team over Zoom. Me and the head of business development worked on these deals to do a huge out licensing deal for $250 million, bring some cash in. We had to fire 450 people my 3rd week in the job level. And you're like, okay, when you're a CEO, that's decisions you have to make. Those are tough enough. Now imagine you're doing over Zoom. People are sitting in their living room and their kids are playing at their feet. You just told them they lost their job. That freaking sucked. It was awful. But if we hadn't done it, we also, the previous CEO had taken out $400 million in debt that we couldn't service. Wow. So the risk of taking those jobs, and I asked the recruiter, like, where am I on your list? He goes, you're about the 6th guy I'm calling. I go, why? He goes, everybody thinks this is a disaster. They can never pull it out of this thing. I'm like, I guess when I show up, something's really bad.
So what happened after that?
So we got it cleaned up. We got it cash flow positive in about 6 months, and we increased the share price in a buyout by about $5 a share. And so it was bought by Covis back in, I was there for 5 months.
Wow.
A long 5 months.
That was a long 5 months.
It was a lot of sleepless nights, but it was a big success story for the shareholders.
Yeah, that's great. So how do you think about, because I mean, so much of the work of the drugs that are developed, I mean, they can save lives, and how do you balance the access of those drugs with the profitability?
That's a great question. So probably our biggest successes have been in cancer and oncology treatment. Like in bladder cancer, we had a very active drug that did well and was bought by Fusion Pharma. But you have to look at, I'll give you the example. There was 2 companies out there. One was called Juno and one was called Kite Pharma. And they had these allogeneic CAR T programs that treated hematological cancers. And they would take your cells out, they would take them to a facility, reprogram them, and then they would meet you back at the facility to be reinfused. And they had very, very good response rates. But that supply chain to get those cells out, to get them reprogrammed, and when you sent it towards the hospital, you didn't have any time to really miss that patient. During the pandemic, that was a problem. The CAR T programs were so good, but the hospitals never made money at it, and they still don't, because it's so complicated. So now one of the most promising technologies is called in vivo CAR T, where there are companies trying to retrain your immune system to build its own CAR T cells within your body. And then so you don't have to rely on the drugs coming back in your body. It's your body producing these things. Now there's all kinds of risks to that, but that's what innovation has done to get to a point where they're removing the expense of the supply chain. But so if you, in the early days, the innovation was worth a lot of money. Both Kite and Juno were bought for billions of dollars by, I think it was Gilead maybe, and BMS bought one of them, and I forget who bought the other one. But they've been tough businesses to run because the hospitals are a little wary to use them.
So you mentioned CAR-T. So what are some of the main biotech breakthroughs that you're excited about?
I'm not allowed to give investment advice.
No.
But, no, I think I can talk about Umoja because I became the chairman there late last year. They're doing this in vivo CAR-T, and it's really pretty special. That one, I think, if it works, we have to run another clinical trial, but I think in non-human primates, it looks great. Those things will change the world. I mean, some of you are not that young or old, but back in the old days, people who got hepatitis C were going to get a liver transplant. Yeah. Well, that stopped when the treatments came along from Gilead and just cut down hepatitis C in its tracks. They almost ruined their own business model. They cured everybody. The population.
The problem's gone.
Yeah, the problem was gone. So in pharma, people always say they want chronic therapies because they have like diabetes, the GLP-1s that are so crazy right now. Those people will be on those drugs the rest of their life, most likely. So those are good business models. But in cancer, we're not curing all the cancers, but we're definitely improving life. So I think the area I'm most interested in, I'm not sure I have the courage to tackle it, but like ALS and Alzheimer's, I hope somebody finds something for that. Because I know friends who've died from that, and it sucks. Because there's nothing really to treat them.
Where do you think the GLP-1s are going?
I think they're going to have to fix this muscle wasting problem they have, because I'm a little worried. Like when I grew up, all the athletes were using anabolic steroids. And so anabolic steroids were great drugs for people who were in physical rehab. You could gain your muscle mass back quicker, because especially people who had gait problems or whatever. I'm a little worried the GLP-1s are going to be overused. And there was a kerfuffle after the Super Bowl about HIMSS, some of the claims they made. I'm hearing stories that, as you work onto those drugs, you take a higher and higher dose until it levels off, right? Well, I hear the story that the spouse then takes the lower dose pens and uses them too, without a prescription. I've heard those stories. I want to try them. Like, these are real medicines. You shouldn't mess around with it. If you want to lose a few pounds, get on the treadmill or your Peloton. It'd be better than your Peloton. But they have side effects. The muscle wasting is one thing.
Peloton?
I'm not. You're not. I'm a runner or a semi-weightlifter.
What about AI? How about AI?
Boy.
What do you think? AI and biotech.
That's Apple Intelligence. I have an iPhone. I grew up when the information superhighway was figuring itself out. I think it's a good idea, and just a little bit of AI that I see being used can help you answer questions faster. Might even help you write a paper for grad school. I don't know. I didn't have that. I wish I would have. I think the issue is you have to know what questions to ask AI to get the answer. And when I was running IT at J&J, I always said there's data and information and insight. Because one of the problems J&J had back then, they had crap tons of data, but they had no way to organize it, and then they couldn't use it to make decisions. So if AI helps any entity, a life sciences company, a tech company, whatever, make decisions better to make them more profitable, speed up the development process, AI is worth it. But we were talking before back when I grew up in drug discovery and drug development, high throughput screening, you can look it up in Google and find an old article about it. It was about the fastest way to find druggable targets usually they were small molecules. And it worked great. They're like, this drug will work on that, this drug will not. And it did kind of show an effect, except the drugs themselves were so insoluble you couldn't mass produce them. They did not work. And I was saying J&J spent billions of dollars on high throughput screening, because I built a lot of the Linux cluster systems in IT to that kind of computing power almost 30 years ago now. But it didn't help them make better decisions. Mm-hmm. And if AI isn't going to help us make better decisions, which means we have to get better at asking better questions, then it's going to be useful, but I just don't see it yet.
How about all the work that's been done on protein folding? It's a Nobel Prize.
I have to pass on that one. I need a helpline. I haven't worked in that.
Yeah, or
I have not worked in that. Mostly oncology.
Yeah, but it's interesting whether or not they could build, whether or not they can predict how soluble the technology.
If that can do it, they
That would be huge.
Yeah.
That'd be huge. All right, so how about global challenges? So how can biotech help in solve global problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you think about our food supply or water supply, there were people working on organisms that could go out and eat that massive plastic island thing that's floating around.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Clean up oil spills. There's always a bit of a biotech biology science to that. There's probably. I also, because I had some experience in med tech. I think I'm a diabetic. I have been for 29 years. And I wear one of these continuous glucose monitors. It's unbelievable. Goes right to your iPhone. Before you had to prick your finger like 20 flipping times a day. You couldn't even type. Your fingers hurt so bad. And it was telling you what your blood sugar was probably 30 minutes ago. Now it's telling it right now. I mean, I think we'll be wearing a lot more sensors and there is a Dexcom closed loop system that can manage your pump. I don't wear a pump, but that now we're talking the interface of information or insight into drug delivery. And that's awesome because think of the number of people, elderly, incapacitated people, whether it's mental or physical, they just can't take the drugs they need. And so they're overdosing, underdosing. These kind of things could save lives.
So let's shift gears a little bit. So let's talk about funding. So advice for biotech and entrepreneurs seeking funding.
Polsky. Dr. Stephen Gould, and he's created this new fund, I guess it's going to fund some UFC startups.
Yeah.
I know Stephen. Have a very simple proposition. If you're going to go meet with investors, as a startup, you want to be, I got to have a platform. I got to have all these programs, but you really got to have one that works. And people don't want to bet on a single asset company that's risky. So you might have a backup to it, but don't offer 20 things because chances are a small biotech, they can't fund 20 things. And make sure it works. Be very focused on a lot of the companies that I took over that were distressed had way too many things going on. They were trying to be this and that. The others like, hey, do any of these things work? And we'd have to ferret them out, and cut them and cut people, unfortunately, and find the one to focus on and drive to a goal. So if you're going to look for funding, be very clear in your message, short and sweet. Be really clear on what you're going to do. Your use of proceeds and how that's going to work is going to be really important. They're going to want to know that, and you need to be committed. If you're the one asking for the money, you're the CEO or chief science office founder, they're investing in you. They'll sort of believe you're going to make the science work. If you've got some decent data and you know how to explain it, but make it incredibly simple. Don't make it extravagant. Don't, just make it really simple.
So how do you assess which technologies?
Well, my career was built mostly in the later stage development, commercialization. Some of you have worked in the industry, I know, or in funding. And in pharma or in biotech, we have something called the target product profile. And it just basically lays out what that drug should be at the end of phase 2. What's the dose going to be? What's the safety profile going to be? What's the efficacy look like? And how does that compete with what the market will be when it's approved? That's one of the toughest corners to look around. You're looking, when I joined Cascadian and we found tucatinib and we're working on it, there were like 17 other HER2 positive breast cancer drugs in the market. And so all these investors are like, why the hell would I invest in you? I should invest in that guy, Macrogenics, margetuximab. It's going to be a great drug. That thing sucked. It didn't even work. And then we had other ones. Our biggest competitor was neratinib. That drug worked well on breast cancer, but if you were a woman on that drug, you could have up to 13 bowel movements a day. Do we all know what a bowel movement is? You had to take over a dozen loperamide or wear a diaper because that was the side effect of that drug. So we knew we were balancing efficacy with safety. It was a pill. So how do you assess that? You have to build that target product profile and compare it. Now in the world of regulatory, you cannot do a direct comparison in a PowerPoint presentation if you haven't run the trial. That's your public service announcement for not going to jail or paying fines. You cannot make those statements. But you can talk about it and talk about your superhero skills of your drug. That's what ours was the brain cancer.
So how do you navigate the regulatory environment while innovating?
Very carefully. No, I think what I would say, having dealt with the FDA and the DEA, my last job at J&J, I was sort of the drug czar. I managed all the controlled substances. So I used to have to go meet with the DEA. So I had the DEA and the FDA. The greatest time I walked into a room like this was meet about 6 or 7 people from J&J. Well, you understand the DEA is part of Treasury, part of the government. They're all law enforcement. And at the time, the director of the DEA was a female leader. They're all wearing a sidearm. They all have a gun. I'm like, this is going to be a tough crowd. Yeah. Everybody's armed but us. But when you deal with the FDA, what we found, back to the Chikatnib story, was we're a little tiny company. We want to run this in patients that are third-line metastatic breast. So they've been treated with 2 to 3 to 4 other agents before they even get to us. So they're really beat up. And their life expectancy or overall survival was maybe 6 months at the time. It was bad. And we said, we want to do this, and we also want to study and take the measurements of the tumors in the brain and see if we can improve it. And we'd like to do it in a big trial, but only 1 trial. We don't want to do 2. And I remember the lady, in a very nice way to me, said, you're either crazy or stupid. But no one else has ever tried this, because she goes, they die faster. I go, yeah, the women with brain mets die twice as fast. We know that. So which is going to potentially make your trial fail. They'll die too soon, and you don't get the response rate. You don't get the overall survival rate. We're willing to try this because we believe in it. And they're like, God bless you, go forward. And we sold the company before the data read out, but it was positive on all 3 endpoints. And their overall survival, I don't remember the final number. I never looked at that trial, but I think it was almost a year versus 6 months, which means a lot when you're dying.
Absolutely. So
the FDA worked with us. They allowed us to do that one trial, 480 patients.
Wow. So how about ethical considerations? How do they factor into?
Yeah, well, the Hippocratic Oath, although I didn't go to medical school, we do have a medical student. The Hippocratic Oath is, do no harm. But when you're dealing with people, we got another doctor too. We got all kinds of doctors.
Yeah, we got a bunch of them.
Good for you guys. Go into business. When you're dealing with certain diseases and they're in their late stages, people will take enormous risk because the cost of exit is low at that point. Right, and the risk could be high. These CAR T drugs I was talking about earlier, I don't know if you were around when those happen, you get this thing called cytokine release syndrome, which it jacks up your immune system so much it starts to attack your own system. And they figured that out quickly. They got a few people died from it, but unfortunately, they were probably going to die anyway. They were so sick. But that was a risk those patients are willing to take. It really lies with the providers, the patients, and their family. It is, if you don't take this drug, what's going to happen to you? So we actually follow, there are certain safety rules you have to follow with the FDA, both while you're doing the trials. If they have an adverse event, how do you report it? If you have a severe adverse event or a grade 4, grade 5, which requires medical treatment or is death, you have only a certain amount of time to report that, and then the FDA decides what to do. Do they put you on clinical hold? Are you okay? It all depends on what you're doing. I mean, in my world, we were always dealing with late stage cancer, so we could have fairly potent drugs and people were willing to try them. But GLP-1s, they're getting out there. I mean, they seem to be working. The safety profile looks pretty good. So they're going to, I'm also the chairman of a vaccine company. Those are usually very long trials because they have to be very safe, unless, of course, you're in the middle of a pandemic, and then they do emergency use authorization. So,
okay. So I want to open it up to questions in just a second here, but common misconceptions that MBAs may have about biotech?
Don't get hung up in a title. I got to be the senior vice president of something or other. Biotechs, you can join a big biotech company like Biogen or Vertex or one of those, and those are big machines. Like join a big tech. You want to go work at Amazon or Google or somewhere, that's fine. The smaller biotechs tend to be really scrappy. They're fairly small. They'll be Convergent, which is a radio pharmaceutical company, castration-resistant prostate cancer. It's 15, 17 people. AMAG was a biotech company. We had 800 people. You won't have all the resources you want. Maybe you came out of big pharma and you came back to business school. Biotechs are scrappy. You make your own slides. You make your own copies. You fill the coffee machine yourself. The lights go out or do I have a stroke? No, it's not frothy. It's not working, a fancy company with foosball machines and all that stuff. Although I've seen those, a lot of them failed because they spent their money on that stuff. But it'll be the funnest job you ever had. A lot of you will be, if you haven't done it before, you can get recruited to do business development. Everybody thinks that's the funnest. I'm gonna go do deals, both buy and sell side. Those are great careers because you learn so much, but you will have never worked so hard and done so little in your life. Most deals don't get done. But getting how you get into life sciences, lots of ways in. You can be a physician and go into banking. I was a consultant, information and a strategic consultant, went into portfolio management. There are lots of ways in. Financial skills work in every industry. So then we talked about earlier, how do hospitals work? What's the issue with small biotech? Cash flow, cash burn, raising money on the private side, dealing with venture capitalists. Oh, you go public, now you got activist shareholders coming after you. I mean, it is tough in biotech right now. It's not been great the last couple of years. But if you love life sciences, there's really no place like it. You help people, you can make a little money. But you love what you do. You do it. You can also go into defense, automotive, travel. I don't know. There's all kinds of things you can do with your lives. Software development.
Okay, this has been great. So I want to open it up to the students who I'm sure have questions for you.
Come on, Hayden. Are you going to use your next week's question?
Well, I guess one thing I'd like to hear a little bit is how you're thinking about some of these current regulatory headwinds. Like we talk a lot about like the IRA, Medicare negotiations, some of the NIH funding, snafu. Like, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I have, I'm not an operator. I retired or got fired in my last job as CEO, and I decided, I'm not patient enough to deal with running companies anymore. So I became chairman of several companies and been an independent director. There's a problem in drug companies. I'll say that covers both small molecule, large molecules. They haven't always done the right job in showing value of what they do. So everybody thinks those drugs are so expensive. So we want to negotiate the price of the drugs down. And I may insult somebody here if you worked for Cardinal or McKesson or one of these companies. When you get behind the economics of when you get a drug approved and it has to go to market, those people in the middle to get your drug on the shelf or get it into retail, they take huge rebates and want huge discounts from the manufacturer. So that money that we charge gets diluted down in the middle before it ever makes it to the patient, and nobody really understands it. So we have to jack up the price, and then it looks like we're making all the money when in fact we're not. And also remember, there's a certain patent life on that drug. I mean, some of the biggest drugs in our life, like Keytruda, are going to be coming off. Humira is coming off now. AbbVie has Skyrizi and some of these that followed it, but they have to pour. I mean, even the little companies I ran, like Cascadian, a small molecule pill for breast cancer, all in before that drug got launched, consumed probably $800 million. And that's a low price tag. And you have phase 3 failures. So around pricing, specifically IRA or anybody that wants to lower the cost, I think there are these common medicines like insulin, statins, stuff that's gone generic. They should be relatively cheap for people. I mean, we lived overseas, my family and I, for 5.5 years in Belgium, and I worked, and I was a Belgium employee, a Swedish employee with a Swedish Social Security card. So I got all my healthcare paid for in Sweden. You didn't pay anything because it all came out. Now you had really high taxes. I mean, but that did it. But around here, I think we need to probably split the classes of drugs. I mean, if these are truly life-saving, or the one drug that came out that cured blindness, I mean, it's kind of the MasterCard commercial. It's priceless if you can do that, but how many people are going to pay for that, or who's going to pay for that? That's on the pricing side. I think Chicago could help. I mean, maybe that's where AI can get. I think Amazon and AWS, with how they could actually have the supply chain, that they could maybe do a better job than some of the distributors. But now, the other question, like the funding for the NIH or the funding for CDC or funding for FDA, if that stuff starts to get cut, the industry's going to have a problem, because it's still takes a while to get a drug approved anyway. If that slows down because they cut the staff, they don't have accelerated approval pathways or something, that it's going to just, if you go into little biotech, you're just going to have to raise that much more money and hold on long enough to get the data that's really going to get you funded or get you bought by somebody. But if they cut the staff, if those review and approval slow down, it's going to be problematic. The flip of that, I would say, in 2021, we had way too many IPOs. We went from an industry of like 300 or 400 biotech to almost 1,000. If you really, I saw a slide from Goldman Sachs, the 150 car pileup on the highway of all these companies that have gone bankrupt. They've reverse merged into another private company, so their trading symbol could be moved over to a new company, and the shareholders wanted to change because the companies failed miserably. We have to watch that. Like how many, I don't even know how many GLP-1 companies there are. It's a dozen. And there's already approved products. So how are they going to really differentiate? I hope they do, but I don't know. It'll really suppress innovation.
Outside of TPPs, how do you decide if a small mid-sized company is really promising and you want to go work there?
Yeah, I mean, let's say you're coming in. Let's say you're coming into the C-suite. You want to know where the people you're going to work with, their experiences, and get to the chemistry of the actual chemistry of the drug, but the chemistry of that team has got to be very good. The board of directors will probably, unless you know somebody on that board, it's going to be a little harder. But if it's a venture-backed one, you could have all investors on that board. Those are really difficult, really difficult. And I've walked into some of those, and we had to flip the board to more independent directors, and that was a battle. Because there's always the thing with investors. I say, well, I wear two hats. I'm an investor and I'm a board member. Like, no, you don't. You just wear one hat. You care what your IRR is in your fund. It's a nice thought. But I've been doing this 20 years. I would also say for all of you, something that I learned is, because when we do these treks and stuff, I look at people's CVs. I always pick a few things out of it. Whatever it is, there are other pronouns than I and me. There's like we. Like, did you build a team? Did you help somebody get promoted? How do you lead people? Because if you're going to be in those biotechs, you're not going to just be a doer. You're going to be a leader on that team. So that's really important. And know your superhero skill. What are you freaking good at? And how are you going to add value to that company? Because they're making a big bet on you. These aren't huge companies. So they may have you coming in as chief business officer and you need to get a non-dilutive capital deal done and bring cash into that company because they can't raise money in the market. It's one of these tests in little biotech. You can say you're as good as you think you are, but they're going to know very quickly if you're not. So be careful. Look yourself in the mirror like, here's what I do well. Here's what I don't do well. And I'm going to go find that job. And nothing beats networking, meeting people all over the place. You never know where that opportunity is going to show up. Yeah.
Thanks for being here, Scott.
Sure.
You did a brief jaunt in medtech and then sort of biotech.
Yeah.
So what did you enjoy about medtech, and how does that compare to biotech?
Yeah, when you're a European medtech company, there's a thing, is it a CE mark or whatever it is? The CEO gets to sign the approval of the product. It was fantastic. I'm like, what do you mean? They're like, well, you got to believe it, because if they come and audit and it's wrong, they're going to pull it off the market. I'm like, oh, I didn't know they could do that. But once you were convinced, that it's called the CE mark. You sign all these papers and off it's approved. You can start marketing. And then, there's always an audit there, of course, and the FDA can come and audit for sure. The development cycles are much shorter than drugs. For diagnostics, the pricing and the reimbursement is really tough. You really have to understand what your relative value is versus state of the art or standard of care, and how much you can charge for it. There's the world of what we would call heavy iron, the big scanners and the blood analyzers and the CT scanners, MRIs, all that. But then ours was like a small device that measured exhale nitric oxide out of your breath, and it would actually give you a biomarker that would say how much inhaled corticosteroid you should take to keep that inflammation down, so you didn't have an acute exacerbation and end up in the ER. And our product worked great. It was kick-ass. We even got one of those nice approvals in the UK where we got reimbursed because we reduced the number of emergency room visits. I couldn't convince most of Blue Cross Blue Shields in the US to cover the cost at like $30. They just like, no, everybody uses spirometry. It's just fine. And we would show how we were better. They didn't care. They didn't want to pay for, because we would charge the doctors like $10 a test and he could bill it at 20, a buy and bill model, very common and very, very legal. And the insurers didn't want to hear the story about a new test that, they didn't think that patients need. I'm like, well, if you talk to somebody that took their kid to an ER, because spirometry, you blow as hard as you can for as long as you can 3 times. So by the 3rd time, you're just gassed. Ours was a 10-second blow smoothly into a machine and you get a number. And it got down to, I think, 15 seconds. The answer came out and it worked. It was a slog. We got it. We increased the sales dramatically. It was a lot of fun. You had a device. I worked with Microsoft on their health vault and protecting information and share it with doctors. You use a lot of things in med tech. Hard to make money. And one of the fallacies of med tech is, well, the only way you make money is if you have an installed base. You have these machines everywhere. And we had a consumable product or trailing revenue model that you'll learn about in business school. And that worked, except when your machine breaks or something goes wrong. Then you have to have a service team because these doctors who paid you up front for all these tests don't use it. They're really pissed off. And you got to have a service technician go somewhere to fix these machines. So there's pluses. I loved it though. I did it for 4 years. It was a riff. I really enjoyed it, but I wouldn't do it again. Pharma was more fun. I mean, I said do it because you like to do it. Both my parents died from cancer. My mom's was environmental. She was a smoker her whole life and died from lung cancer. The day that we got the first offer on the company from Eli Lilly, I was sitting there negotiating with him. And my sister called and said she had died of cancer. Right? 2 years later, I was in the middle of the AMAG deal, and my sister called me again and said my father had died of very rare cancer, and I was in the middle of the AMAG deal getting it. And I was like, man, I've given my life to benign and malignant hematology, and I lost both my parents. So I'm very passionate about oncology. It's what I'm doing most of. I'm kind of staying away from some of the other types of companies now.
Building off that point, you're on boards of a number of different companies that are working in new modalities in the oncology space, radiopharma, CAR-T, ADC. Which of them right now is catching your eye the most and making you the most excited?
I think that the in vivo CAR-T could change cancer treatment dramatically. It'll probably start in liquid tumors, but then if it can be put towards solid tumors, Cargo was a big company that just went in the tank recently, unfortunately. It was, people expected a lot from that. And the drug worked, but it didn't have durability. It couldn't get past 3 months. That one I think is the Star Warsy winner of all. If it works, it has worked. Radiopharma, so that's Convergent in prostate cancer. Very hot area. Raise Bio was bought. Point Therapeutics was bought. Mariana was bought. Raise Bio was bought. I mean, and people are still more of them being created. So we're in prostate cancer. I think that now that the actinium-225, the radioisotope supply is coming through now, I think that's going to be good for everybody. I think that those drugs will work really well. Or I'd like to see something more. Some of you may know bladder cancer is very difficult to treat. And once you've gotten your bladder removed, it's a downward slide of complications and comorbidities. We sold our drug to Fusion Pharma was the other one that got bought. So we sold Vofatimab to Fusion, and they were working on bladder cancer when that's why they bought it from us. But that space is very hot, very hot. The other one is Zentalis. That's an ovarian cancer drug. That drug works. We know it works. Now we just got to show it work in a bigger trial.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, what's your outlook on bispecific T-cell engagers?
Well, I think they're important. I mean, I think it was just the way, I think generics, I mentioned to you before, like some of these older meds like statins and ACE inhibitors or insulins should probably be generic and be available to a lot more people. Some of these, I don't know how you put a timeline on it, but if biosimilars can meet the same bioequivalency and you can do it at a lower cost, we should go that way. I don't think that's a problem. Pharma companies shouldn't have a monopoly on these things. That's not possible.
I'm not an MBA, I'm from the policy school. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what regulators could do to incentivize work in like acute curative treatments rather than chronic treatments.
So, sorry, to incentivize what kind of treatments?
Like the acute curative treatments versus, chronic care.
I mean, I think, I don't know if they even break it down that way. I mean, if you're talking about acute, like give me an example, like ALS, once you the slide of ALS or
You mentioned like
because they don't, one of the things they don't do well, like the drugs for sepsis and infectious disease, the reimbursement on those things is crap. Nobody wants to go into those fields because they don't get a lot of money back, which is crazy because people die from sepsis.
We have a problem with antibiotics.
Anti-infectives are a very challenging class of drug.
What do we do with this?
I think our friends at Managed Care, some of which have been in the news lately, they've run models that say it'll just be easier to treat them when they're sick. It'll be cheaper than proving a new expensive drug. We'll just wait till they get sick, and if they're in the hospital, we'll treat them then, and we'll do the best we can. That's how we're not gonna prove it. You're gonna have, they'll put a step edit in there, they'll do something. Because those sepsis drugs took a long time to get approved and paid.
Wait, your question though was about like how do you get drug companies essentially to cure diseases instead of providing long-term care?
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
I know him better, so
She's my translator. Yeah. Well, I mean, Gilead and those they basically cured hepatitis C. I mean, people are trying to cure cancer. The problem is when you're dealing with oncology cells, they mutate very quickly. It's like trying to cure AIDS back in the day. HIV was replicating so fast, like COVID. We haven't figured that out either. I think if the science is there, they should pay for it. But nobody's really come forward, like the one that cured the eyesight, okay? They haven't made that broadly available. The thing like with Umoja is their goal, and Andy Scherenberg's vision is that he will have community oncologists using his drug versus only at the big academic centers. And by that way, you will knock cancer down even faster. But the regulators are not going to incentivize unless they would have to change the way you run your trials. But in fact, lately with what they call Project Optimus, they're actually making you do more work to do more dose ranging than you used to do. So it's actually going the other way. It's more expensive, more time consuming.
So the students have class.
Oh, bummer.
In about 4 minutes.
No.
Oh, sorry, 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Going
So any last thoughts?
I don't know. I was this kid that just couldn't get to where he wanted to go, and I worked really hard. The other thing I'd say, going into any of these companies, take the hardest one you can get a hold of because you can't screw it up more than the people that are running it now. Be proud to do that. I did. I mean, I've had some companies that were literally on their fingernails holding the cliff. Take risk. Take hard jobs. Go if you get asked to go to another country, do it. Pack up your family, bring them. They were like in the 5th and 8th grade or something. We went. It changed their life, I think, for the better. And it changed my life. I was not the simple country boy with a blue passport anymore. I was a guy that lived and worked for 9 years overseas in all kinds of crazy places. Had all kinds of crazy experiences. So take those risks when you go out. And the last thing I do is, so the first track was really it was my idea to pay for it, but Inbar Goodman was a student here. Now she's head of finance in Israel for Amgen, I think, and she was head of BD in Switzerland for. She was one of you, and she called me out of the blue. And maybe it was Julie Morton and one of the other deans. Like, hey, this lady wants to meet you. She wants to do something. How could you help? And you and your wife give money to the school. What can we do for her? And she's like, I'd like to get people out and I was like, oh, I've had that idea. What can we do? And she's like, I'll get a bunch of people and we'll come see it. So come up with those ideas about how you can improve the experience for yourself and your fellow students, and help your fellow students out. Someday you help them, they're going to come back and hire you.
That's great. Okay, so thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you.